Hey guys, tonight we find ourselves on the shores of a long, narrow fjord. The wind bites at your exposed skin, carrying the salty tang of the sea and the faint scent of wood smoke. Seagulls shriek overhead, their calls echoing off the steep, granite cliffs that rise on either side. You're clad in rough-spun wool, the fabric scratching against your skin, and the leather boots on your feet feel heavy with the ever-present mud. The air is thick with anticipation, and honestly, a little bit of dread. You're about to step into the world of the Vikings. A world where survival is a daily grind, and where one wrong decision could leave you feeding the ravens. You probably won't survive this, at least not in a literal sense, hopefully. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The year is roughly 900 AD, give or take a few decades. You're standing in a small Viking settlement, maybe somewhere in Norway or Denmark. Imagine the relentless wind constantly whipping around you. It cuts right through your thickest furs. You feel it deep in your bones. The cold is a constant companion, especially during the long, dark winters. It's a cold that seeps into everything, the earth, the wood of your house, even your thoughts. You see, it wasn't all raiding and pillaging, not even close. Most Vikings were farmers, eking out a meager living from the unforgiving land. The soil is thin and rocky. Tilling it is back-breaking work. You wield a heavy wooden plow, pulled by a stubborn ox that seems to resent your very existence. You spend your days coaxing barley and rye from the earth, praying for a decent harvest. Historians still argue whether the Viking agricultural practices were actually sustainable in the long run, or if they simply exhausted the land and moved on. You glance over at the nearby fjord, the gray water churning restlessly. The sea provides, but it can also take away, and you hope the next storm brewing on the horizon leaves you in peace. Inside your longhouse, the air is thick with smoke from the central hearth. It stings your eyes, but it also provides warmth and light, precious commodities in this harsh land. Your family huddles together, sharing stories and songs. Your kids are playing with wooden toys, pretending to be fierce warriors, little do they know the reality of battle. You might not know it yet, but those wooden toys weren't just for fun. Turns out that Viking kids sometimes got buried with their toys. Some historians suggest it was to keep them entertained in the afterlife, while others think it was a status symbol. A grave with toys shows that the family was wealthy enough to afford them. The longhouse is more than just a dwelling, it's the heart of your family, a refuge from the elements, and a symbol of your connection to the land. It's a sturdy structure, built with thick timbers and a sod roof, designed to withstand the brutal Scandinavian weather. Speaking of longhouses, some of them were seriously long. We're talking over 70 meters, the size of a football field, and big enough to house dozens of people and animals. You think to yourself, if only I had that kind of space to entertain. Food is a constant concern. Fish is a staple, supplemented by whatever crops you can grow and the occasional hunt. Meat is a luxury, reserved for special occasions. You imagine feasting on roast boar, the crackling skin and succulent meat, a welcome change from your usual fare of dried fish and porridge. You're probably also drinking ale or mead, a honey-based wine, brewed with whatever ingredients you can get your hands on. It helps take the edge off the day, and maybe even dull the constant aches in your body. You're not sure which one is more potent. The nights are long and dark, filled with the howling of the wind and the crackling of the fire. You gather around the hearth, listening to stories of gods and heroes, sagas of epic battles and daring voyages. These stories are more than just entertainment, they are a way of passing on knowledge, values, and traditions. You hear tales of Odin, the All-Father, and Thor, the mighty thunder god, and maybe a story about the world serpent, Jormungand, so big that he encircles the entire world. You might even hear the legend of Ragnar Lothbrok, the famous Viking king, and his sons. It's a romanticized story, of course, but it still inspires courage and a desire for adventure. You wonder if you will ever leave your village and see the world, or if you will spend your days toiling in the fields until the day you die. But it's not all just farming and storytelling. You also need to be ready to defend your village from raiders. You practice with your axe and shield, honing your skills in combat. You are no stranger to the sight of blood. Raiding wasn't just something the Vikings did to other people, sometimes they raided each other. You stand shoulder to shoulder with your neighbors, a united front against any threat. You are also a skilled craftsman. You carve intricate designs into wood, weave cloth, and work with metal. These skills are essential for survival, allowing you to create tools, weapons, and clothing. You admire the craftsmanship of a finely made axe, the gleaming steel a testament to your skill and ingenuity. There are rumors of blacksmiths who can craft swords so sharp that they can slice through bone. The same sword might cost a year's salary. Talk about having expensive taste. Religion is an integral part of your life. You worship the Norse gods, offering sacrifices and prayers in the hope of gaining their favor. You believe in fate, the idea that your life is predetermined by the Norns, the goddesses of destiny. You see the signs of the gods in the world around you, in the changing seasons, the storms that rage across the sea, and the birth of new life. But don't worry if you don't believe in the Norse gods, because some Vikings were actually Christian, especially towards the end of the Viking Age. You also believe in an afterlife, a place of glory and honor for warriors who die in battle. You imagine yourself feasting in Valhalla, the Hall of Odin, surrounded by brave heroes and beautiful Valkyries. You raise your horn of mead, toasting to victory and eternal glory. You're not a warrior just yet, but that doesn't mean you don't want to be. But you do wonder if this means only people who die in battle get to go to Valhalla. You imagine some poor farmer who lives a long life, doesn't get to go. Despite the hardships, there is a sense of community and belonging. You are part of a larger network of family and friends, bound together by shared experiences and a common purpose. You celebrate festivals and rituals together, marking the changing seasons and honoring the gods. You are a part of something bigger than yourself. This is a life of hardship and struggle, but it is also a life of resilience, courage, and unwavering spirit. You are Viking. Okay, settle in, friend. Let's talk rain. Specifically, the stuff pelting down on you right now. Feel that? That insistent thwop on the windowpane. Imagine that, but colder. Much, much colder. And imagine it's you, trudging through a muddy Norse landscape, a landscape perpetually draped in a damp, gray, well, everything. You're soaked. Miserable. Probably thinking wistful thoughts about a dry longhouse and a flagon of mead. Because that, my friend, was the Viking experience, at least some of the time. And the question becomes, what did you, a soggy Viking, do about it? Well, let's just say LL Bean hadn't quite set up shop yet. Gore-Tex was still a twinkle in some future chemist's eye. Umbrellas? Frivolous. So, you look to the most readily available resource, animals. Fur, hide, leather, anything that might offer a smidge of protection from the elements. Now, you're probably picturing yourself swathed in luxurious beaver pelts, looking like some sort of rugged, Viking-era fashion icon. The reality was, somewhat less glamorous. Think less, chic outerwear, and more, whatever dyed recently and wasn't too riddled with holes. You're talking about roughly scraped animal skins, probably stiff, probably smelly, and definitely not waterproof in any meaningful sense of the word. Imagine a sheepskin rug, nice on a cold floor, right? Now imagine wearing it in the rain. It gets heavy. It smells like, well, sheep. And it certainly doesn't breathe. You'd be wetter from the sweat on the inside than the rain on the outside. Lovely. The most common options were likely sheepskin, goatskin, and maybe even sealskin if you lived closer to the coast. Each had its advantages and disadvantages. Sheepskin, while readily available, was notoriously absorbent. Goatskin was a bit tougher, but also more difficult to work with. And sealskin, well, that was the premium option, offering a denser, more water-resistant barrier, assuming you knew how to properly prepare it. The process wasn't exactly as simple as popping down to your local tannery, either. It involved soaking, scraping, stretching, and treating the hides with various natural substances, like animal brains, delicious, tree bark, or even urine. Yes, urine. Don't knock it till you've tried it. Apparently, the ammonia helps with the tanning process. You just know that had to make for some interesting campfire stories. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but what about something a little more sophisticated? And that's where things get interesting. There's evidence, albeit fragmented and debated, that the Vikings may have experimented with more advanced methods of waterproofing. One possibility is the use of oil-based treatments. Remember whale oil? That stuff wasn't just for lamps, it was also potentially used to waterproof clothing and even sails. Imagine slathering yourself in whale oil. It's probably not going to smell like roses, but hey, at least you're marginally drier. Although, good luck getting that smell out. You'd basically be a walking, talking, greasy candle. Another technique, and one that's still practiced in some parts of the world, involves using fish skin. Yes, fish skin. Imagine peeling the skin off a cod, tanning it, and sewing it into a jacket. It sounds utterly repulsive, I know, but fish skin is surprisingly durable and water-resistant, especially when treated properly. Historians still argue whether this was widespread, but some archaeological finds suggest that the Vikings were at least aware of the technique. Think of it, you could tell people you're wearing Versace, when in reality you're rocking dead cod couture. And what about the wealthy Vikings? Did they have better options? Probably. The wealthier you were, the finer the quality of the hides you could afford, and the more skilled the artisans who would prepare them. You might be able to commission a tunic made from the finest sealskin, treated with the best oils and dyes, and decorated with intricate embroidery. Think Viking, haute couture. But even then, it wasn't going to be perfect. Rain is a relentless adversary, and even the best animal skin garments would eventually succumb to its persistent assault. You see, the Vikings were masters of adaptation. They didn't have the luxury of popping into a store and buying a waterproof jacket. They had to work with what they had, using ingenuity and resourcefulness to survive in a harsh and unforgiving environment. They weren't afraid to experiment, to try new techniques, and to learn from their mistakes. They were, in essence, the original DIY survivalists. Historians still argue whether these methods were enough to keep the Vikings completely dry, but even if they weren't, they were certainly better than nothing. I mean, being wet and miserable is one thing, but being hypothermic and miserable, that's a whole different level of unpleasantness. Now, let's not forget about the other aspects of Viking weather protection. It wasn't just about the clothes you wore, it was also about the structures you lived in. Longhouses, for example, were designed to provide shelter from the elements. They were built with thick walls of wood or turf, and their roofs were often thatched with straw or reeds. This provided insulation and helped to keep the interior warm and dry. Well, relatively dry. Let's be honest, Viking longhouses weren't exactly known for their watertight construction. There were probably leaks, drafts, and damp spots aplenty. But hey, at least it was better than sleeping outside in the rain. Probably. And then there were the sails. Viking ships, the iconic longships, were obviously exposed to the elements. The sails, typically made of wool or linen, would have been treated with various substances to make them more water-resistant and durable. Think of it as Viking-era sailcloth waterproofing. Tanning agents, oils, and even beeswax might have been used to coat the fabric and protect it from the ravages of the sea. Can you imagine the effort required to create a sail large enough to propel a longship across the ocean? It was a massive undertaking, requiring the combined efforts of skilled weavers, tanners, and sailors. But back to you, standing there in the rain, decked out in your finest, or, least holy, animal skin garb. You're probably still wet. Probably still cold. But you're also a Viking. You're resilient. You're resourceful. And you're not going to let a little bit of rain ruin your day. You'll probably just complain loudly to your fellow Vikings about it. That, and contemplate raiding a nearby village just to get warm. Ultimately, the Vikings' attempts at weather protection were a testament to their adaptability and their ability to thrive in challenging conditions. They didn't have the benefit of modern technology or advanced materials. They had to rely on their knowledge of the natural world, their skills in crafting and building, and their sheer determination to survive. And while their methods might seem primitive by today's standards, they were effective enough to allow them to conquer vast territories, explore new lands, and leave a lasting legacy on the world. In fact, some of the techniques they used, such as tanning and oiling hides, are still used today in various forms. So, the next time you're reaching for your Gore-Tex jacket, take a moment to appreciate the ingenuity and resourcefulness of the Vikings, who braved the elements with nothing but animal skins and a whole lot of grit. And maybe a little bit of whale oil. Or urine. Depending on the day. Okay, settle in, friend. Let's talk about animal skins. You're probably picturing some rugged frontiersman, a mountain man battling the elements, all snug in his buckskin duds. And yeah, on a crisp autumn day, maybe that works. But what about when the sky opens up? What about when the rain starts coming down in sheets, turning the ground to mud and the air to a bone-chilling damp? Suddenly, that idyllic image gets a whole lot wetter. You trudge through the forest, the rain plastering your carefully crafted animal skin cloak to your back. At first, it's not so bad. You can almost feel a sense of accomplishment. I conquered nature, you think. I made this cloak with my own 2 hands, and maybe a flint knife, and it's protecting me. That feeling lasts, maybe 10 minutes. Then the water starts to seep in. Not a deluge, mind you, but a gradual, insidious dampness. The skin, once supple and relatively lightweight, begins to absorb the moisture. It gets heavier. Much heavier. Each step becomes a little more labored. You start to feel like you're carrying an extra sack of potatoes on your shoulders. A very wet sack of potatoes. The smell, the smell. Wet animal skin doesn't exactly conjure images of fresh laundry and spring meadows. It's more like wet dog, mixed with something vaguely primordial, something that crawled out of the earth a very long time ago and then decided to take a bath in a swamp. You try not to breathe too deeply, but the smell is pervasive. It's everywhere. It's in your hair. It's in your dreams. You suspect it's even judging you. And the discomfort. The chafing. Imagine wearing a damp, slightly scratchy burlap sack for hours on end. That's pretty much what it feels like. The skin rubs against your skin, creating a friction that intensifies with every movement. You start to long for the sweet relief of taking it off, but you know you can't. The rain is still coming down, and without the skin, you'd be soaked to the bone. It's a lose-lose situation. Sort of like that time I tried to assemble IKEA furniture without the instructions. You know, painful and ultimately futile. You push onward, the weight of the wet skin pressing down on you. Your muscles ache. Your joints creak. You start to question all of your life choices that led you to this point. Was that extra slice of pizza last night really worth it? Should you have invested in a good umbrella instead of that limited edition bobblehead? These are the important questions you ponder as you slowly morph into a human-shaped swamp creature. Now, let's get a little historical here. We often romanticize the resourcefulness of our ancestors, their ability to survive in harsh conditions with only the bare essentials. And, to be fair, they were pretty resourceful. But let's not pretend that life was all sunshine and rainbows. The simple fact is, staying dry in the pre-industrial era was a challenge. Animal skins were one of the best options available, but they were far from perfect. They were heavy, smelly, and not particularly waterproof. Think of them as the flip phone of rain gear. Functional, but definitely not cutting edge. There's this whole subculture out there, a fringe movement, really, that believes our ancestors were far more advanced than we give them credit for. They claim ancient civilizations possessed secret technologies, lost knowledge, and the ability to, I don't know, weave waterproof fabric from spiderwebs or something. While it's fun to speculate, the archaeological evidence is, shall we say, lacking. But hey, who am I to judge? Maybe there were ancient raincoats made of spider silk. Maybe they just disintegrated over time. Or maybe, just maybe, people got wet a lot more often than we think. Historians still argue whether the discomfort and impracticality of animal skin significantly impacted daily life. Did it restrict travel? Did it affect hunting efficiency? Did it contribute to the common cold? We may never know for sure. But one thing is certain, wearing wet animal skin wasn't exactly a picnic. Let's talk about what happens when you're not moving. Let's say you finally found a bit of shelter, maybe a rocky overhang or a dense thicket of trees. You huddle there, shivering, trying to conserve body heat. The wet skin, instead of insulating you, now acts as a giant, cold compress. It leaches the warmth from your body, leaving you feeling chilled to the bone. You try to build a fire, but the wood is damp, and your hands are numb. You fumble with your flint and steel, sparks flying uselessly into the air. After what feels like an eternity, you finally manage to coax a tiny flame into existence. You feed it small twigs, praying that it will catch. Slowly, painstakingly, the fire grows. You hold your hands out to the warmth, feeling the heat slowly penetrate your skin. But the skin itself? It's still wet. And now, it's steaming. The smell intensifies, filling the air with a pungent odor that makes your eyes water. You feel like you're being slowly boiled in your own clothes. It's like a really depressing spa day. And then there's the drying process. Once the rain stops, and the sun finally peeks through the clouds, you face a new challenge, drying the skin. You spread it out on a rock, hoping the sun will do its magic. But as the skin dries, it shrinks. It tightens. It becomes stiff and inflexible. Remember how supple it was before? Gone. Now it's more like a piece of dried-out rawhide. You try to work it, to soften it up, but it's a losing battle. The skin is permanently altered, its texture forever changed by the ordeal. It's a little like that sweater you accidentally put in the dryer. It's still a sweater, technically, but it's not quite the same. It's a little smaller, a little scratchier, a little sadder. The whole experience is a constant reminder of your vulnerability, your dependence on the elements. You're not in control. Nature is in control. And nature, it turns out, has a rather cruel sense of humor. Like that time I tried to bake a soufflé. Total disaster. The kitchen looked like a bomb had gone off. And all I wanted was a light, fluffy dessert. Is that too much to ask? Speaking of discomfort, there's a rather unsettling historical account of Vikings using animal skins as makeshift sails. Imagine being crammed into a longship, battling gale-force winds, with a sail made of, well, you get the picture. The smell alone must have been enough to drive a person mad. You'd think they would have preferred just using their shields, but no, they thought animal skins were better. Quirky tidbit time. Did you know that some cultures believed that wearing certain animal skins could imbue you with the characteristics of that animal? Wearing a bear skin, for example, was thought to make you stronger and more courageous. Wearing a fox skin might make you craftier, sneakier. I'm not sure I'd want to test that theory. I'd probably end up tripping over my own feet and getting stuck in a bush. Historians still argue whether the symbolic significance of animal skins outweighed their practical drawbacks. Was the perceived benefit of connecting with the animal spirit worth the discomfort and inconvenience of wearing a wet, smelly hide? It's a question that gets to the heart of what it means to be human, our enduring relationship with the natural world, and our willingness to endure hardship in pursuit of something more. Or maybe they were just cold and needed something to wear. Who knows? Alright, settle in, settle in. Let's get cozy, shall we? The wind is howling outside, but here, in our little, mine forge, it's warm and dry. You're probably still dripping from yesterday's downpour, huh? Yeah, I can see it in your imaginary eye. We've been talking about the Viking relationship with rain, and how it permeated their whole existence. And now, the fun begins. Because let's face it, surviving in a perpetually damp climate requires innovation. And the Vikings? Surprisingly innovative. You see them now, huddled around a crackling fire, the smoke stinging your eyes just a little. They're looking disgruntled. Water is still beating on their rough-spun cloaks, mocking their attempts to stay dry. Last time we left off, they were using wool for a reason, but it clearly wasn't working wonders. It's heavy, itchy, and smells like wet sheep, which, frankly, it is. So, what to do? Time for some good old-fashioned trial and error. Here's where the oil and grease come in. Imagine the scene: a gruff Viking, let's call him Bjorn, because of course he's named Bjorn, stares intently at a freshly butchered seal. Actually, seals were a pretty important resource for the Norse. They provided meat, blubber, and skins, and, yes, even a way to stave off the wet. Bjorn is thinking, this blubber, this greasy, smelly stuff, could be the answer. It repels water, after all, on the seal. Why not on him? You watch as he, or perhaps his wife Astrid, because let's be real, Astrid probably did most of the actual work, begins to painstakingly render the seal blubber. It's a slow, laborious process, involving melting the blubber down in a large cauldron, skimming off impurities, and generally creating a pungent, oily mess. And let me tell you, that smell, it clings. It probably clung to Bjorn and Astrid for weeks. Imagine trying to woo someone smelling like that. I mean, you wouldn't be wrong, but you would probably smell like you belonged in the sea. Once the oil is rendered, it's time to apply it. You picture Astrid taking a brush, perhaps made from animal hair or rough plant fibers, and carefully coating the wool cloak with the rendered seal oil. It's a messy job. The oil soaks into the fibers, turning the wool a darker, richer color, and making it even heavier. And stickier. And, yes, even smellier. The finished product? Let's just say it's an acquired taste. You can almost feel the greasy weight of the cloak on your shoulders. It definitely sheds water better than plain wool, but it's still far from perfect. Rain still seeps in around the edges, and the oil eventually washes out, requiring reapplication. But hey, it's a start. The Vikings were nothing if not persistent. Now, you might be thinking, seal oil? That's kind of niche. And you'd be right. While seal oil was certainly used in some areas, particularly those with ready access to seals, the Vikings weren't exactly picky. Any available fat or oil would do. Fish oil, rendered animal fat, pigs, cattle, sheep, whatever they could get their hands on. Even, potentially, plant-based oils if they could extract them. Remember, resourcefulness was key to Viking survival. And speaking of resources, this oiling and greasing wasn't just for clothing. Think about sails. A waterlogged sail is a heavy sail. A heavy sail slows you down. And slowing down on the open ocean is not a good idea. So, you bet they were slathering their sails in oil and grease to keep them lighter and more efficient. In fact, the sails of the Viking ships were often treated with a mixture of tallow, rendered animal fat, pine tar, and other ingredients to make them water-resistant and durable. Historians still argue whether the specific recipes varied regionally, or if there was a universal, Viking sail treatment that was passed down through generations. But one thing is certain, they took their sails seriously. You can just see a bunch of Vikings, again probably Astrid, painstakingly applying layer after layer of this greasy mixture to the massive sail. It's a backbreaking job, and the smell is, well, let's just say it's not exactly Chanel No. 5. But it got the job done. It made the sails more resistant to the elements, and helped propel those longships across the vast and unforgiving ocean. But here's a little quirk for you: the Vikings also used oil and grease for their hair. Yup. You read that right. Apparently, a shiny, well-greased head of hair was considered fashionable. It probably also helped to keep their hair from freezing in the harsh Scandinavian winters. Think of it as Viking hair gel. But less citrusy. More seal Y. And you know what else is quirky? There's some evidence suggesting that the Vikings may have even used beeswax to waterproof their gear. Beeswax, as you probably know, is naturally water-resistant. And while beeswax wasn't exactly abundant in Viking-age Scandinavia, it was available. Whether they used it extensively for waterproofing is debatable, but the possibility is certainly intriguing. Imagine Bjorn smelling faintly of beeswax, trying to woo Astrid. At least it would be an improvement over seal oil. But the thing is, waterproofing wasn't just about comfort or fashion. It was about survival. Remember, these people were constantly exposed to the elements. Hypothermia was a real threat. And wet clothes accelerate heat loss. So, anything they could do to stay dry, even a little bit, could mean the difference between life and death. This brings us to a crucial point: Viking technology was often driven by necessity. They didn't have access to the advanced materials and technologies we have today. So, they had to make do with what they had. And that meant experimenting, innovating, and adapting. You watch as a group of Vikings, huddled together in their oil-soaked cloaks, brave the relentless rain. They're not exactly comfortable, but they're alive. And they're learning. They're refining their techniques, experimenting with new materials, and constantly striving to improve their odds of survival. I feel like that is a pretty good life lesson to learn. You might even apply it to your current life. Now, let's talk about leather. Leather was another important material for the Vikings, and like wool, it needed to be treated to make it water-resistant. You can almost hear the rhythmic pounding of mallets as Vikings work on hides. They're tanning them, softening them, and, yes, oiling them. Leather boots, leather gloves, leather jerkins, all crucial for staying dry and protected in the harsh Scandinavian climate. But tanning leather is a complicated process. It involves treating the hides with various substances to prevent them from rotting and to make them more durable. And you know what one of the most common tanning agents was in Viking-age Scandinavia? You guessed it, tree bark. Specifically, oak bark. The tannins in the oak bark react with the proteins in the hide, creating a stable, water-resistant material. You observe as a Viking tanner, carefully soaking the hides in a solution of oak bark and water. It's a slow, painstaking process, requiring constant monitoring and adjustment. Too much tannin, and the leather becomes brittle. Too little, and it rots. But with patience and skill, the tanner transforms a raw hide into a valuable and durable material. And here's a little-known fact: Viking women were often the primary tanners. It was a messy, smelly, and time-consuming job, but it was also a crucial one. The quality of the leather could make or break a pair of boots, a set of gloves, or even a sail. So, Viking women played a vital role in ensuring the survival and success of their communities. Now, let's get back to those leather boots. Imagine yourself trudging through the muddy fields of Viking-age Scandinavia. Your feet are encased in thick, oiled leather boots, protecting them from the cold and the wet. But even the best leather boots aren't completely waterproof. Water can still seep in around the seams, and the leather can eventually become saturated. So, what to do? Well, the Vikings had a few tricks up their sleeves. One common technique was to stuff the boots with grass or straw. This helped to absorb moisture and keep the feet warm. It also provided some cushioning, making the boots more comfortable to wear. It's a bit like built-in insoles. Although I wonder how often they were changing that grass out to prevent molding. I guess you could always feed it to your animals too, so I suppose it is a win-win. Another technique was to use wooden soles or platforms. These raised the feet off the ground, preventing them from coming into direct contact with the mud and water. Wooden saws were particularly useful in marshy or boggy areas. Basically, those Vikings were ahead of the shoelift trend. And here's where it gets really interesting. Some historians believe that the Vikings may have even used rudimentary forms of caulking to seal the seams of their leather boots and other gear. Caulking involves filling the seams with a pliable material to prevent water from seeping in. The Vikings may have used things like beeswax, pine tar, or even clay to caulk their seams. Historians still argue about the extent to which the Vikings used caulking techniques. The archaeological evidence is scarce, and it can be difficult to distinguish between intentional caulking and accidental residue. But the possibility is certainly intriguing. It suggests that the Vikings were constantly experimenting with new ways to improve their waterproofing techniques. Now, you might be thinking, all this oiling and greasing sounds like a lot of work. And you'd be right. It was a constant battle to stay dry in Viking-age Scandinavia. But the Vikings were nothing if not resourceful and determined. They used every tool and technique at their disposal to protect themselves from the elements. And in the process, they developed a sophisticated understanding of materials, technology, and the environment. But let me just say, imagine you have to carry around all of these greasy clothes. That would be exhausting. At least your skin would be nice and moisturized. Silver linings. So, as you huddle closer to the fire, and imagine the howling wind and the relentless rain, you can appreciate the ingenuity and resilience of the Vikings. They may not have had Gore-Tex or waterproof zippers, but they had oil, grease, leather, and a whole lot of determination. And that was enough to keep them alive, and thriving, in one of the wettest, wildest places on Earth. And now, perhaps, with a slightly deeper understanding of Viking attempts to defeat the rain, you can drift off to sleep. Sweet dreams, of seal oil and beeswax. Okay, let's just, settle in, shall we? Get comfy. Maybe grab a blanket, a cup of chamomile, or, a lukewarm energy drink if that's your vibe. No judgment here. We're going to talk about fish oil. Yes, that slightly pungent liquid that your grandma probably swore cured everything from the common cold to existential dread. But we're not talking about ingesting it, unless you're really into that sort of thing. We're talking about using it to protect stuff from getting wet. Like, really wet. Picture this, you're out in the wilderness. The sky, which just moments ago was a picturesque cerulean, has transformed into a swirling vortex of gray. Rain is pelting down, each drop a tiny, icy dagger aimed at your exposed skin. You trudge forward, your boots sinking into the mud with each step. The meticulously crafted shelter you spent hours building is now looking less like a cozy haven and more like a soggy, leaky sieve. Your spirits are dampening faster than your socks. This, my friend, is where the humble fish oil comes to the rescue. I know, it sounds unorthodox. Like suggesting you fight a bear with a bag of marshmallows. But trust me on this. Before the advent of Gore-Tex and synthetic polymers, people relied on what they had at hand. And in many coastal regions, fish oil was as ubiquitous as seagulls and questionable seafood. You see, the indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest, for example, were masters of waterproofing. They used fish oil, often extracted from salmon or eulachon, a small oily fish also known as candlefish, to treat everything from their clothing and baskets to their canoes and even their houses. And when I say houses, I'm not talking about cute little hobbit homes. I'm talking about massive, multi-family longhouses built to withstand the harsh coastal climate. The process was relatively simple, if a bit fragrant. The oil would be rendered from the fish, then applied liberally to the chosen material. It might be heated to improve penetration, or mixed with other substances like beeswax or tree resins for added durability. The result? A water-repellent barrier that could withstand the constant onslaught of rain, wind, and salt spray. Think of it like this, you're slathering your belongings with a delicious, albeit fishy, layer of waterproofing. Like giving your jacket a spa day, only instead of cucumber slices, it's getting a dose of omega, 3 fatty acids. And speaking of delicious, or not so delicious, depending on your olfactory sensitivities, let's talk about the smell. Yeah, it's not exactly Chanel No. 5. More like, a fish market after a particularly hot day. But hey, think of it as a natural predator repellent. Bears might be scared off by the lingering aroma of eau de poisson. Or maybe not. I wouldn't bet my life on it. But hey, a man can dream. It's definitely better than getting eaten. Now, before you rush out and buy every bottle of fish oil you can find, there are a few things to consider. First, not all fish oil is created equal. The quality and effectiveness of the oil will depend on the type of fish it's derived from, the rendering process, and the presence of any additives. You want the purest stuff you can get your hands on, without any artificial flavors or colors. Because, let's be honest, nobody wants their waterproofed gear smelling like artificial lemon. Second, application is key. You can't just splash some fish oil on your tent and expect it to become impervious to the elements. You need to apply it evenly, allowing it to penetrate the fibers of the material. Multiple coats may be necessary, especially for more porous surfaces. And remember to let it dry completely between coats. Otherwise, you'll end up with a sticky, oily mess that attracts dust and insects like moths to a flame. And let's be real, nobody wants to cuddle up inside a sticky, oily, insect-infested tent after a long day trekking through the woods. Unless, maybe, you're into that sort of thing. Again, no judgment. Now, you might be thinking, okay, this sounds vaguely interesting, but why are we talking about fish oil in the 21st century? We have all sorts of fancy synthetic waterproofing products available. And you'd be right. But there are still plenty of reasons to consider this ancient technique. For one, it's a sustainable and renewable resource, at least when sourced responsibly. Unlike many synthetic waterproofing agents, which are derived from petroleum and can be harmful to the environment, fish oil is a natural byproduct of the fishing industry. And in a world increasingly concerned about sustainability, that's a definite plus. Plus, fish oil is often cheaper and more readily available than specialized waterproofing products, especially in remote areas. Imagine you're stranded on a deserted island, okay, maybe not stranded, but enjoying a leisurely kayak trip that took an unexpected turn, and you need to waterproof your makeshift shelter. Are you more likely to find a bottle of Nikwax or a school of oily fish? I think the answer is pretty clear. It's also worth noting that fish oil can be used to treat a variety of materials, including leather, wood, and even some types of fabric. It's a versatile tool that can be adapted to a wide range of situations. Think of it as the duct tape of the waterproofing world. Except, less sticky and more fishy. And speaking of duct tape, did you know that during World War II, duct tape was originally called duct tape because it was used to waterproof ammunition boxes? True story. It was made with a cotton duck cloth backing and a waterproof coating. Apparently, the name evolved over time as people started using it for everything and anything, and the duct part stuck because of its popularity in sealing air ducts. So, there you have it. Fish oil, the surprisingly effective, surprisingly versatile, and surprisingly smelly waterproofing agent of the past and, perhaps, the future. Before you go slapping fish oil on everything you own, it's important to note that one downside, besides the smell, is that it can attract animals, depending on where you are. Of course, historians still argue whether fish oil waterproofing was truly as effective as modern synthetic alternatives. Some point to the limited lifespan of treated materials and the need for frequent reapplication. Others emphasize the ingenuity and resourcefulness of the people who relied on it for centuries. As with most things in history, the truth likely lies somewhere in between. And on a completely unrelated note, did you know that the average person spends about 6 months of their life waiting for red lights to turn green? Just something to ponder while you're waiting for your fish oil-treated gear to dry. But one thing is certain, fish oil represents a connection to a time when people lived closer to the land and relied on natural resources to meet their needs. It's a reminder that even the most humble substances can possess extraordinary properties. It is quite amazing to think of everything that people used to do. So, the next time you're caught in a downpour, or you're looking for a sustainable way to protect your gear from the elements, consider giving fish oil a try. Just don't forget to bring a clothespin for your nose. And maybe a can of air freshener. You know, just in case. And maybe, just maybe, you'll find that the ancient wisdom of waterproofing with fish oil still holds water today. It's certainly something to think about, isn't it? Now, if you'll excuse me, I think I smell something fishy. Wait, no, that's just the lingering aroma of this fascinating topic. Anyway, I hope you learned something new today. It's always fun delving into the weird and wonderful world of historical DIY. And who knows, maybe this information will come in handy someday. Perhaps on that unexpected kayak trip. Just remember to bring the fish oil. And the clothespin. Alright, that's a wrap for this little exploration into the surprisingly practical world of fish oil waterproofing. Sleep tight, don't let the bedbugs bite, or, more accurately, sleep tight, don't let the fishy smells overwhelm you. Okay, settle in, grab your favorite blankie, maybe a mug of something warm, we're going deeper. You trudge through the perpetually damp landscape, the mist clinging to your eyelashes like tiny, insistent gnats. Leather, as you discovered, only holds up for so long against this relentless drizzle. It chafes, it cracks, it eventually becomes, well, a glorified sponge. You needed a better solution, something that offered more than just a brief respite from the elements. This brings us to waxed wool, a more refined, arguably more civilized, approach to battling the rain. Now, I know what you're thinking, wool. Doesn't wool soak up water like a thirsty camel at an oasis? Normally, yes. But this isn't your grandmother's scratchy, unyielding wool sweater. This is, enhanced wool. Wool with a secret. Imagine yourself standing in a windswept, coastal village, the air thick with the smell of salt and, something else. Something vaguely, greasy. That's probably the wax. The process, at its heart, is surprisingly simple. You take raw wool, ideally something sturdy and densely woven, and saturate it with a wax-based concoction. Traditionally, this was beeswax, sometimes mixed with pine resin or tallow to improve its flexibility and water resistance. Think of it like giving your wool a really, really good spot treatment. The wax coats each individual fiber, creating a barrier that prevents water from penetrating. Instead of soaking in, the water beads up and rolls off, leaving you, relatively, dry and comfortable. Or at least, drier and more comfortable than you were with that leaky leather jerkin. The key to effective waxing lies in even distribution and penetration. You wouldn't want patchy protection, would you? Picture walking down the street and someone yells out, "Hey, why is your left shoulder drier than your right?" Humiliating. So, the process typically involved immersing the wool in a vat of molten wax, or repeatedly brushing it on in thin layers, allowing each layer to cool and harden before applying the next. It's a labor-intensive process, no doubt, but the results were worth it, especially for those who spent their lives outdoors, braving the elements. This technique wasn't exactly new. Evidence suggests that seafaring communities, like those in Scandinavia, were experimenting with waterproofing fabrics as early as the Viking Age. Can you imagine a Viking longboat, sails billowing, the crew clad in waxed wool, braving the North Sea? Pretty badass, right? In fact, Vikings were known for using animal fats, including lanolin, wool grease, to protect their clothes and sails from the harsh maritime environment. Now, here's a quirky little tidbit for you. It's said that some Scottish clans even used urine, yes, urine, in their waxing mixtures. The ammonia in urine supposedly helped to set the wax and improve its water resistance. Think about that next time you're complaining about the smell of modern waterproofing treatments. At least it's not, that. Waxed wool offered a significant advantage over other materials of the time. It was more breathable than leather, allowing perspiration to escape and preventing you from feeling like you were trapped in a clammy, suffocating bag. It was also more durable than untreated wool, resisting wear and tear and providing better protection against wind and abrasions. It even offered a degree of insulation, trapping air between the fibers and keeping you warm even when wet. The best of all worlds, it would seem. But of course, nothing is perfect. Waxed wool had its drawbacks. For one, it was heavy. All that wax added significant weight to the fabric, making it less suitable for activities that required agility and speed. Imagine trying to scale a castle wall in waxed wool armor. Not exactly the recipe for a successful siege. It was also relatively stiff and inflexible, restricting movement to some extent. And then there was the smell. Depending on the ingredients used, waxed wool could have a distinctive, and sometimes unpleasant, odor. Remember that greasy smell from the coastal village? Multiply that by several layers of fabric and you've got a pretty good idea. It certainly wouldn't make you the most popular person at the local tavern. Furthermore, the wax coating wasn't permanent. Over time, it would wear off, especially in areas that were subjected to frequent rubbing or abrasion. This meant that you would have to re-wax your garments periodically to maintain their water resistance. Think of it as a medieval version of reapplying sunscreen. But perhaps the biggest drawback was the flammability. Wax, as you might imagine, is not exactly fire-resistant. In fact, it's quite the opposite. A stray spark from a campfire or a carelessly discarded torch could quickly turn your waxed wool cloak into a blazing inferno. So, you had to be extra careful around open flames. A lesson learned perhaps the hard way. Despite these drawbacks, waxed wool remained a popular choice for outerwear for centuries, particularly in regions with wet and windy climates. Think of shepherds tending their flocks in the Scottish Highlands, fishermen braving the stormy seas off the coast of Cornwall, or farmers working the fields in the rain-soaked valleys of Wales. For these people, waxed wool wasn't just a fashion statement, it was a necessity, a vital tool for survival. The use of waxed wool clothing became particularly prevalent in the 19th century, during the Industrial Revolution. The rise of factories and manufacturing created a demand for durable and weather-resistant workwear. Waxed wool was ideally suited to this purpose, providing protection for factory workers, railway employees, and other outdoor laborers. It was also during this period that the technology of waxing evolved. New and improved waxes were developed, offering better water resistance, durability, and flexibility. Manufacturers began to experiment with different fabrics and weaves, creating waxed wool garments that were both functional and stylish. The waxed cotton equivalent, however, began to eclipse waxed wool after technological advances made the former easier to produce. Speaking of styles, can you picture this? A gentleman strolling down a cobbled street in Victorian London, sporting a stylish waxed wool coat and a neatly trimmed beard. He's probably on his way to the theater, or perhaps to a clandestine meeting with a shadowy figure in a dimly lit alleyway. A waxed wool coat, after all, is the perfect garment for concealing secrets and navigating the murky underworld of Victorian society. Here's another fun little fact: the British military used waxed wool extensively during both World Wars. Think of soldiers slogging through the trenches of the Western Front, clad in waxed wool coats and trousers, battling not only the enemy but also the mud, rain, and cold. The waxed wool provided a degree of protection against the elements, helping to keep them warm and dry in the face of unimaginable hardship. It was a testament to the enduring practicality of this ancient technology. But did you know that some historians still argue whether the widespread use of waxed wool actually contributed to the spread of certain diseases during wartime? The argument goes that the dense, waxy fabric could trap moisture and bacteria, creating a breeding ground for infections. It's a grim thought, but it highlights the complex and often contradictory nature of history. So, where does that leave you, standing here in the drizzle, contemplating the merits of waxed wool? Well, it depends on your priorities. If you value durability, weather resistance, and a touch of historical authenticity, then waxed wool might be just the thing for you. It's a tangible link to the past, a testament to human ingenuity and our enduring struggle against the elements. Just be mindful of those campfires. Nobody wants to see you go up in flames. Especially me, because then who would I talk to? Alright, settle in, settle in. Let's talk about staying alive when the weather really wants you dead. Picture this, you're a Viking. Maybe you're about to hop in your longship and visit England, or maybe you're just trying to get to the privy without freezing your unmentionables off. Either way, you need to be ready. And let me tell you, those Norse guys, they knew a thing or two about layering. First, you've got your base layer. Think of it like your thermal underwear, only, you know, made of actual wool, not some fancy synthetic blend. Now, wool is amazing stuff. Even when it's wet, it still keeps you relatively warm. That's key when you're spending a lot of time on the open sea, getting splashed by icy waves. You're probably thinking, ew, scratchy wool. And yeah, sometimes it was. But necessity is the mother of invention, and not getting hypothermia is a pretty big necessity. This innermost layer would likely be a tunic, maybe reaching your knees. Simple, practical, and probably smelled faintly of sheep. Or maybe not so faintly. Over that base layer, you might add another layer of wool. A thicker tunic, perhaps. Or maybe a pair of wool trousers, called broch. These weren't exactly skinny jeans, mind you. They were likely loose-fitting, allowing for freedom of movement. After all, you couldn't exactly swing an axe effectively while wearing leggings. Comfort and practicality, that's the Viking way. Or it was until they discovered chainmail. And speaking of chainmail, hold that thought. I'm getting ahead of myself. Before we get to the heavy stuff, let's talk about insulation. Remember all those sheep I mentioned? Well, Vikings weren't just using their wool for clothes. They were also using it for padding. Think of it like the Viking equivalent of a down jacket, only without the ethically questionable goose plucking. So, you might have a padded coat, stuffed with wool or even animal hair. This would trap air, creating a warm layer of insulation. It's kind of like how a thermos works, but, you know, on your body. And while we're on the subject, I bet you're wondering about colors. Did Vikings only wear drab, earthy tones? Actually, evidence suggests they were quite fond of bright colors. Reds, blues, yellows, they used dyes derived from plants and minerals to add a splash of vibrancy to their wardrobe. So, imagine a Viking warrior, not as a grim, monochrome figure, but as someone rocking a vividly dyed tunic under their chainmail. Fashion-forward and fearsome. Now, about that chainmail. Also known as Bernie by some in that time. This was the premium level of protection. Small, interlocking rings of iron, painstakingly crafted to create a flexible, yet incredibly strong barrier against blades. Owning chainmail was a sign of wealth and status. It was expensive to make, and expensive to maintain. And heavy. Very, very heavy. You wouldn't exactly be running a marathon in it. You were much better off just being intimidating and having everyone leave you alone. But against a determined foe, chainmail could be the difference between life and, well, a rather unpleasant death. Underneath the chainmail, you would still wear layers of padding, both for comfort and to help absorb the impact of blows. Without padding, the chainmail might protect you from being cut, but the force of the impact could still break bones or cause serious bruising. So, think of it as a medieval airbag, but made of wool. It's worth noting that the production of chainmail was a specialized craft. Each ring had to be individually made and linked together, a process that could take months, even years, to complete a single shirt. Alright, so you're wearing your wool base layers, your padded coat, and your shiny new chainmail. But what about your head? Vikings weren't exactly known for their bareheaded strolls through the fjord. Helmets were another crucial piece of gear. And no, contrary to popular belief, they probably didn't have horns. I know, sorry to burst your horned helmet bubble. That's more of an opera thing than a Viking thing. Historians still argue whether horned helmets ever existed in ritual settings, but there's no solid archaeological evidence to support their use in combat. Instead, Viking helmets were typically simple, conical or rounded designs, often made of iron or leather. Some helmets had a nasal guard to protect the nose, and some even had eye guards. Function over fashion, that was the general idea. Underneath the helmet, you might wear a padded cap, again, for comfort and protection. Think of it as a medieval beanie, but designed to prevent your skull from being crushed. Now, what about your legs? We already talked about broker, those loose-fitting wool trousers. But for added protection, some Vikings might wear leg wraps, or vindingr. These were strips of cloth, usually wool, that were wrapped around the lower legs, providing warmth and support. They also offered a degree of protection against cuts and scrapes. Think of them as the Viking equivalent of gaiters. And finally, we come to the feet. Nobody wants cold, wet feet, especially when you're raiding monasteries. Footwear typically consisted of leather shoes or boots. These were often made from a single piece of leather, folded and sewn together. For added warmth, you might stuff your boots with straw or hay. It's not exactly the most comfortable option, but it beats frostbite. There are some sagas that talk about socks as well, but the jury is still out on exactly how common they were among the average Viking. It's possible some of the higher class ones, or especially crafty shield maidens, had something knitted. So, let's recap. You're wearing your wool base layers, your padded coat, your chainmail, your helmet, your broker, your leg wraps, and your boots. You're basically a walking, talking woolly mammoth. You might be a little sweaty, and you probably smell a bit like a sheep, but you're also incredibly well protected. You're ready to face the elements, and maybe even a few angry Englishmen. Just try not to trip. All that gear can get heavy after a while. But layering wasn't just about protection from weapons. It was also about adapting to changing weather conditions. If you were working hard, you could remove a layer to avoid overheating. If the temperature dropped, you could add a layer to stay warm. It was a flexible system that allowed you to regulate your body temperature and stay comfortable in a variety of environments. It also meant you had to carry all that extra clothing around with you, which probably wasn't much fun. Of course, not everyone could afford all this fancy gear. Most Vikings were farmers and traders, not warriors. They might have to make do with simpler, less expensive clothing. But even the poorest Viking understood the importance of layering. A simple wool tunic and a fur cloak could make a big difference in surviving a harsh winter. And even though you might think of them as hypermasculine, Viking fashion, especially in terms of jewelry and accessories, was for everyone. Men and women would adorn themselves in equal measure. Now, here's a quirky bit of Norse life. Did you know Vikings used urine to soften leather? Yep, you heard that right. The ammonia in urine helps to break down the fibers in the leather, making it more pliable. So, next time you're tempted to judge someone's fashion choices, remember, they might just be following ancient traditions. I'm not suggesting you try this at home, of course. Modern leather conditioners are probably a better option. But hey, it's a fun fact to pull out at parties. You'll definitely be the most interesting person there. Probably. So, there you have it. A crash course in Viking layering techniques. It wasn't always glamorous, and it certainly wasn't high-tech, but it was effective. And in a world where the weather could kill you just as easily as a sword, that's all that really mattered. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to go put on my own layers. It's starting to get a little chilly in here. And no, I didn't pee on my boots. At least, not today. Alright, settle in, pull up a comfy blanket, because we're about to dive head first, well, maybe head and feet first, into the often overlooked, yet crucial, world of Viking headwear and footwear. Forget the horned helmets, that's pure opera, my friend. What did these seafaring Scandinavians actually wear to keep the rain, snow, and general dampness of their existence at bay? Let's explore. Imagine you're a Viking. It's a typical Tuesday in 950 AD, and the North Sea is doing its level best to soak you to the bone. The wind is whipping, the waves are crashing, and your longship is bouncing around like a rubber duck in a bathtub. First order of business: keeping your head warm and reasonably dry. Now, you might be picturing a leather helmet, dripping with water, but you'd probably be further off than you would be if you guessed I used self-tanner. Nope, practicality, not intimidation, was the name of the game. Think wool. Lots and lots of wool. Woolen caps, known as scalar, were the everyday staple. Simple, cone-shaped, and often made from several pieces sewn together, these caps would have been your first line of defense against the elements. Imagine a slightly droopy, warm hug for your head. You can practically feel the scratchy wool against your forehead, can't you? They were often dyed with plant-based dyes, so you might have rocked a fetching shade of earthy brown, or perhaps a more vibrant, albeit faded, blue or green. They weren't exactly high fashion, but they kept the heat in, which, let's be honest, is far more important when you're battling hypothermia on the open ocean. Now, if you were a bit higher up the social ladder, or just feeling particularly fancy, you might have sported a slightly more elaborate version. We're talking potentially fur-lined caps for extra warmth, or even something akin to a hood attached to your tunic or cloak. Remember, status symbols existed even then, and a well-crafted, perhaps even embroidered, head covering would have signaled your position in society. It's like the medieval equivalent of a designer beanie, only instead of a brand logo, you had intricate needlework. And let's not forget the practical applications. These caps weren't just about warmth, they also provided a bit of padding under a helmet during those, less than peaceful moments. Think of it as Viking-era concussion prevention. Of course, a simple woolen cap isn't going to stop a battle axe, but every little bit helps, right? Historians still argue whether specific cap designs were indicative of particular regions or social groups within Viking society. Did the Swedes wear their caps differently than the Norwegians? Did freed thralls get a discount on caps? Were there different knitting patterns? The details are frustratingly elusive, pieced together from fragmented archaeological finds and vague descriptions in the sagas. What we do know is that headwear was essential, and while we might not know exactly what everyone was wearing all the time, we can safely assume that wool was the go-to material. Okay, head protection sorted. Now, let's move on to the foot department. You're tramping through a muddy field, on your way to pillage a nearby village, purely hypothetical, of course. What are you wearing on your feet? Definitely not Crocs. Think more along the lines of durable, practical, and, hopefully, waterproof-ish. The standard Viking footwear was the score, a simple leather shoe or boot. These weren't the exquisitely crafted, knee-high boots you might see in a historical drama. These were functional pieces of equipment designed to protect your feet from the rough terrain and the ever-present moisture. Imagine a low-cut shoe made from a single piece of leather, carefully stitched together around the foot. That's your basic score. The construction was typically turn-shoe construction. This means the shoe was initially made inside out and then turned right side out after the sole was attached. This creates a smooth, comfortable interior, avoiding any irritating seams that could rub your feet raw during long journeys. Genius, right? It's like the footwear equivalent of a stress ball for your feet. Now, the type of leather used varied depending on availability and wealth. Cowhide was common, but goat, sheep, and even sealskin were also used. The thicker the leather, the better the protection, and the longer the shoe would last. Which was crucial because, let's face it, nobody wants their shoes falling apart mid-raid. That's just bad luck. For added warmth and insulation, particularly during the colder months, Vikings would stuff their score with grass, straw, or even animal fur. This created a surprisingly effective barrier against the cold and damp. It's like the medieval version of thermal socks, only significantly less pleasant smelling after a long day. Can you imagine the foot odor? Yikes! And speaking of unpleasantness, Vikings didn't exactly have access to sophisticated waterproofing techniques. They might have treated the leather with animal fat or beeswax to provide some level of water resistance, but let's be realistic, these shoes weren't exactly Gore-Tex. Walking through a bog was still going to result in soggy feet, regardless of how much beeswax you slathered on. Think of it as a gentle reminder of the harsh realities of Viking life. A quirky tidbit. Archaeological finds have revealed that some Viking shoes were deliberately made with the hair side of the animal skin facing outwards. This might seem counterintuitive, but it provided extra grip on slippery surfaces. Imagine walking on a hairy doormat, but strapped to your feet. It was certainly a resourceful solution to the problem of icy terrain. It was also probably extremely unpleasant. Moving up the leg, you might find vetlingar, which were leg wraps made of wool or linen. These weren't exactly socks in the modern sense, but they provided an extra layer of warmth and protection for the lower legs. Think of them as proto-gaiters, warding off the worst of the cold and mud. They were typically secured with leather straps or woven bands, creating a snug fit. They also probably itched like crazy. Now, you might be thinking, okay, this is all well and good, but what about special occasions? Did Vikings have fancy shoes for parties? And the answer is, probably not. While some shoes have been found with decorative stitching or embellishments, the focus was generally on practicality rather than aesthetics. Remember, these were people who valued function over form. A durable pair of shoes that could withstand the rigors of daily life was far more important than a flashy pair of sandals for showing off at the local meat hall. Although I would love to see the Viking version of Pimp My Ride, but with leather and bone. Historians still debate the extent to which footwear reflected social status in Viking society. While more elaborate shoes with finer leather and more intricate stitching undoubtedly indicated wealth, it's unclear whether specific styles were reserved for particular social classes. Did thralls wear different shoes than free farmers? Did shield maidens have custom battle boots? The evidence is limited, and the answers remain elusive. What we do know is that good footwear was essential for survival, and a well-maintained pair of score was a valuable asset in a world where walking was the primary mode of transportation. So, there you have it, a glimpse into the world of Viking headwear and footwear. Not quite as glamorous as the sagas might lead you to believe, but undeniably practical and essential for surviving the harsh realities of life in the Viking Age. Next time you're battling a particularly miserable rainstorm, spare a thought for those hardy Scandinavians, trudging through the mud in their woolen caps and leather score, just trying to stay dry and warm. And maybe, just maybe, consider investing in a good pair of waterproof boots. You'll thank me later. Now, I'm starting to feel a bit drowsy myself, maybe it's the thought of all that wool, but I think it's time to turn in. Sweet dreams, and may your feet always be warm and dry. Alright, settle in, pull that imaginary blanket a little tighter, and let's talk Viking rain gear. Yeah, rain gear. Not exactly the stuff of epic sagas, is it? But trust me, even Vikings, those fearsome warriors who sailed the stormy seas, weren't fans of being soaking wet. And that, my friends, is where archaeology comes in. Imagine, if you will, a team of archaeologists, you among them of course, huddled over a muddy excavation site in Norway. You're brushing away centuries of accumulated grime, your fingers crossed, hoping to unearth some clue, some whisper from the past that can tell you something about how these hardy people dealt with the elements. You're not looking for swords or shields today, you're on the hunt for the less glamorous but equally essential stuff, the rain gear. Now, you might be thinking, rain gear? What's to find? It's not like they had Gore-Tex. And you'd be right. No Gore-Tex back then, sadly. But Vikings were resourceful, adaptable, and pretty darn clever. They had to be, to survive in a climate that could be, shall we say, a little damp. You can practically feel the misty rain on your face as you crouch there. One of the most common types of evidence we find, and I say, we, as if you're not just a figment of my narration, comes in the form of leather fragments. Think of it, tanned animal hides, treated with oils and fats, could be crafted into surprisingly water-resistant garments. You can almost smell the smoky, earthy scent rising from the soil as you gently lift a fragment of what might have once been a protective hood or cloak. Mainstream historical fact, leatherworking was a highly skilled craft in Viking society. People weren't just slapping any old hide together. The tanning process, which could take weeks or even months, involved soaking the hides in solutions of tree bark and other natural ingredients to preserve and waterproof them. It's not exactly a weekend DIY project. Quirky tidbit, ever heard of urine tanning? Yeah, you heard me. Some believe that urine, with its ammonia content, was sometimes used in the tanning process. A bit unpleasant, perhaps, but hey, desperate times call for desperate measures, right? It probably did something for the smell. Historians still argue whether certain tools found in Viking settlements were specifically designed for leatherworking, or whether they were multi-purpose tools used for a variety of tasks. You can picture the debate now, can't you? A bunch of academics, probably sipping lukewarm coffee, arguing about the precise function of a dull-looking bone implement. Such is the life of historical scholarship. But leather wasn't the only material at their disposal. You see traces of woven wool fabrics. Now, wool, when properly treated, is naturally water-repellent. The lanolin, a waxy substance found in sheep's wool, helps to keep the fibers from absorbing moisture. So, imagine thick woolen cloaks, densely woven, providing a layer of protection against the elements. It's not going to keep you bone dry in a downpour, but it's certainly better than nothing. Feel the weight of the wool in your hands as you visualize it. Mainstream historical fact, wool was a staple textile in Viking society. Sheep were a valuable resource, providing not only wool for clothing, but also meat and milk. It's an all-in-one survival package, really. A walking, bleeding, survival package. Quirky tidbit, there's some evidence to suggest that Vikings even used fish skin to make waterproof clothing. I know, right? Fish skin. Apparently, when properly tanned and sewn together, it could create a surprisingly effective barrier against the rain. I wonder if it smelled fishy, though. Historians still argue about the prevalence of fish skin clothing. Was it a common practice, or just something used in coastal communities where other materials were scarce? I mean, you'd have to catch a lot of fish. And then there are the more speculative finds. You uncover fragments of what might have been oiled linen or hemp. Maybe they experimented with layering different materials, combining the water resistance of leather with the warmth of wool. You examine the fragments carefully, noticing the faint impressions of stitching, the subtle variations in texture. Mainstream historical fact, Vikings were skilled sailors and shipbuilders. They understood the importance of protecting themselves from the elements at sea. The Viking longships, with their distinctive designs, were well suited to navigating both coastal waters and open seas. Did you know that there's evidence that they might have used some kind of rudimentary sunstone to navigate? It's like a real-life pirate treasure map. Quirky tidbit, some theories suggest that Vikings may have even used animal bladders as makeshift waterproof bags or containers. I know, it's a bit gross, but hey, they were resourceful. And probably smelled slightly better than urine-tanned leather. Historians still argue about the extent to which Vikings relied on imported materials for their clothing. Did they primarily use locally sourced materials, or did they trade with other cultures for textiles and other goods? I can just picture an overly enthusiastic Viking trying to barter 3 goats for a bolt of imported silk. But it's not just about the materials themselves. It's also about the design of the garments. You find evidence of hoods, cloaks, and even what appear to be rudimentary rain hats. Imagine these garments, draped over the shoulders of a Viking warrior, shielding him from the wind and rain as he rows his longship across the choppy waters. Think about the layers. Maybe it's one thin layer, maybe it's 5. Mainstream historical fact, Viking clothing was often layered to provide warmth and protection in cold weather. Multiple layers of wool and linen would have trapped air, creating insulation. Like a walking, talking, insulated thermos. Quirky tidbit, there are some accounts suggesting that Vikings even used animal fat to waterproof their beards. Imagine slathering your beard with grease to keep it from freezing in the winter. I bet it kept the stray hairs from tickling them, too. Now that's commitment to personal hygiene. Historians still argue about the social significance of clothing in Viking society. Did different types of clothing indicate different social status? Did certain garments have symbolic or ritual significance? Did they, for example, argue about who looked best in a sealskin frock? You carefully record your findings, meticulously documenting the location of each fragment, the type of material, and any other relevant details. You know that these small pieces of evidence, when pieced together, can provide a valuable glimpse into the daily lives of the Vikings. And that's not even getting into the buttons, buckles and clasps that held the garments together. Finding a piece of metal is like a gift from the gods. You close your eyes for a moment, imagining yourself standing on the deck of a Viking longship, the wind whipping through your hair, the rain pelting your face. You're wearing a thick woolen cloak, your hands gripping the oars, your eyes fixed on the horizon. You are a Viking. And you are surprisingly dry. And as you open your eyes, you are back in the present, your fingers covered in mud, your back aching from crouching for too long. But you have a sense of satisfaction, knowing that you have contributed, in your own small way, to our understanding of these fascinating people. What are the odds there's some sort of microbe living in the dirt that will give you superpowers? Pretty low, admittedly, but you can dream. So, next time you're caught in a downpour, remember the Vikings. Remember their ingenuity, their resourcefulness, and their determination to stay dry, even in the face of the most challenging conditions. And be grateful for your Gore-Tex jacket. Because, let's face it, urine-tanned leather probably isn't the most comfortable thing to wear. Okay, settle in, make yourself comfy. Maybe grab a warm drink, something to ward off the chill because we're about to dive headfirst into the wonderfully drafty world of weather and wardrobe in literature. Think of it as historical cosplay, but just the descriptive bits. You trudge through the fog-laden moors of ancient texts, the wind whipping around you, carrying whispers of sagas and stories long past. You're not quite sure where you are, but hey, that's half the fun, right? You adjust the imaginary scarf around your neck, pulling it tighter as you imagine the biting winds described in the Heimskringla, Snorri Sturluson's history of the Norwegian kings. He describes King Harald Hardrada enduring a particularly nasty winter campaign. It's not all epic battles and boasts of glory, though. You get details of men suffering from frostbite, their clothes frozen stiff, and the desperate measures they took to keep warm. And you think your winter commute is rough. The sagas, you see, aren't just about axe-wielding berserkers. They're also surprisingly informative about the practicalities of everyday life in the Norse world. They describe the layers of wool clothing worn for insulation, the fur cloaks that offered protection from the elements. Historians still argue whether the common Norseman wore trousers or leggings more frequently, but regardless, someone was cold. And speaking of wool, did you know that Viking-era wool was often dyed using natural pigments derived from plants and lichens? Imagine the painstaking process of gathering those ingredients. So all those brown and gray movie costumes? Yeah, probably not entirely accurate. And you thought your tie-dye hobby was a commitment. You pull your virtual cloak tighter, the chill seeping into your bones. This wasn't all just about keeping warm, though. Clothing also conveyed status. Richer fabrics, elaborate embroidery, and even the types of furs worn, all signaled wealth and power. In the Njal saga, the descriptions of elaborate clothing at feasts are not just aesthetic flourishes, they are vital in understanding the social dynamics at play. Ever notice how the guy with the fanciest beard and best coat always gets the best seat? Same principle. You see a lone figure in the distance, wrapped in furs. Is it a character from one of the sagas? Maybe. Or maybe it's just some cosplayer who got really lost. You push on, the landscape shifting slightly. Now, let's jump across the North Sea to Anglo-Saxon England, and the epic poem Beowulf. You trudge onward. Forget the monsters for a moment and consider the weather conditions that frame the story. The bleak, windswept landscapes of Scandinavia are integral to the poem's atmosphere. And while Beowulf doesn't go into excruciating detail about Beowulf's wardrobe choices, although you secretly wish it did, descriptions of meat halls warmed by blazing fires paint a picture of the kind of communal spaces where people sought refuge from the cold and damp. You find yourself wondering, though, did Anglo-Saxons even have umbrellas? Surprisingly, yes. Archaeological evidence suggests that parasols, at least, were used by the elite. Now you're thinking that Beowulf would have looked pretty silly slaying Grendel while holding one of those, right? Speaking of Grendel, historians still argue whether Grendel was based on real-life swamp fever. So, perhaps his foulness was more medically explained than demonically, which would make for an interesting screenplay twist. You shift your weight, wishing you'd worn better shoes for this literary pilgrimage. But the scenery shifts again, pulling you into another story. Let's skip ahead a few centuries, shall we? Consider Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. Suddenly, the weather and clothing become less about sheer survival and more about social commentary. You find yourself amidst a crowd of pilgrims, each described with meticulous attention to their attire. The knight, in his simple, battle-stained tunic, stands in stark contrast to the flamboyant pardoner, whose ostentatious clothing is a symbol of his corruption. It is interesting to note that sumptuary laws existed in medieval England, dictating what types of clothing different social classes were allowed to wear. Think of them as historical fashion police, and you might have a faint appreciation for social media algorithms that dictate what shows up in your feed. Now, a slightly quirky thought, do you ever wonder what kind of laundry detergent they used back then? Did they just rub everything on a rock with some soapwort? And here's a fun fact, urine was sometimes used as a cleaning agent in medieval times because of its ammonia content. Okay, maybe that's why the pardoner's clothes were so vibrant. Just kidding. Or am I? You wander through the crowd, eavesdropping on their conversations, the smells of damp wool and wood smoke filling your nostrils. The attention to detail in Chaucer's descriptions creates a vivid sense of place, transporting you back to medieval England. But historians still argue to what extent Chaucer's characters actually depicted the commonality of the English people or whether it was a reflection of his own biases. And it's interesting to note that the Canterbury Tales wasn't even completed. Chaucer only finished 24 out of the projected 120 tales. Perhaps he ran out of parchment. Or maybe he just got bored. You trudge onward, the path leading you towards a new literary landscape. You adjust your metaphorical spectacles as you approach. Now, let's step into the world of Shakespeare. Consider the play King Lear. The storm that rages on the heath is not merely a meteorological event, it's a reflection of Lear's inner turmoil. He is a man stripped bare, both literally and figuratively, as he wanders exposed to the elements, his sanity unraveling along with the weather. Interestingly enough, performances of Shakespeare's plays in his time would have taken place outdoors, in all kinds of weather. So, the actors and audience members really experienced those storms in a way we can only imagine today. And speaking of those outdoor performances, here's a quirky tidbit, they didn't have designated restrooms. Playgoers had to relieve themselves wherever they could find a discreet spot. You might be forgiven for thinking that's a joke. Here's a fact, Elizabethans believed that weather could directly influence mood and behavior. A sunny day might be considered a good omen, while a stormy day could be interpreted as a sign of divine displeasure. Historians still argue whether Shakespeare was a product of his time or whether he subtly questioned these beliefs in his plays. The wind howls around you, mimicking the storm in King Lear. You feel a strange empathy for the mad king, exposed and vulnerable. You find yourself wondering, though, how many doublet and hose changes did the actors do? You wrap your arms around yourself, seeking warmth in the growing chill. But wait! A flash of lightning illuminates a new path. Onward you trudge. Alright, settle in, friend. Let's talk Viking rain gear. Yeah, I know, sounds about as thrilling as watching paint dry on a longship, but trust me, even the most pragmatic Viking worried about getting soaked, and the choices they made in battling the elements said a lot about where they stood in the social pecking order. Think of it as a really, really old version of judging someone by their brand of North Face. So, you're standing there in 10th century Scandinavia. It's drizzling, of course, because when isn't it drizzling? You're imagining the longship, bobbing somewhere across the waves as your Viking friend sails off to England to plunder another village. But wait. How are you dressed, waiting, watching the ship disappear over the horizon? Are you a thrall, a freeman, or maybe even a member of the Jarl's retinue? Look down. That's where the story begins. If you're scraping by at the bottom of the heap, chances are your rain gear is, well, minimal. Think rough wool, maybe treated with a bit of animal fat if you're lucky. A simple cloak or hood to keep the worst of the rain off, but nothing fancy. Probably smells faintly of sheep and damp earth. Not exactly runway material, but it'll keep you from completely freezing. Survival was the name of the game. After all, you've got fields to till, animals to tend, and a general lack of free time to worry about looking fashionable. Rain gear for you is about practicality, not prestige. And, let's be honest, probably not doing a fantastic job of keeping you dry. Now, imagine a slightly more prosperous scenario. You're a freeman, a farmer with your own land, maybe even a skilled craftsman. You've got a bit more wiggle room, and that reflects in your, wardrobe. Your wool is still the primary material, but it's a higher quality weave, denser, and treated more thoroughly with lanolin or beeswax. Maybe you even spring for a leather cloak, tanned and oiled to make it water resistant. It's not going to win any beauty contests, but it's a definite step up from the thrall's soggy existence. You see, freemen had more autonomy, more control over their resources. This allowed them to invest in better materials, more skilled craftsmanship. Plus, appearances mattered. You want to project an image of competence and success, especially when dealing with your neighbors or attending a thing, the Viking assembly. No one's going to take you seriously if you're shivering in the corner with a leaky cloak. It's about signaling your worth, showing that you're a respectable member of the community. And here's a quirky bit. Some historical sources suggest that Viking men, particularly those involved in seafaring, might have used oiled bird feathers sewn onto clothing to create a rudimentary form of waterproof outerwear. Imagine a feathered cloak, glistening in the rain. Bit impractical, perhaps, and probably smelled awful after a while, but definitely a conversation starter. Oh, this old thing. Just plucked it off a few disgruntled seagulls. Keeps me bone dry. Now, let's crank things up a notch. You're part of the elite. Maybe you're a wealthy merchant, a respected warrior, or even a member of the Jarl's inner circle. Now we're talking serious rain gear. Think layers of high-quality wool, expertly woven and dyed with expensive pigments. Perhaps even imported fabrics from far-off lands. Leather wasn't just oiled, it was crafted into elaborate tunics and leggings, embossed with intricate designs. And forget the cloak, you're rocking a sealskin or bearskin coat, lined with fur. The difference is night and day. It's not just about keeping the rain off, it's about making a statement. You're displaying your wealth, your power, your status. Every detail is carefully considered, from the quality of the materials to the skill of the craftsman. It's a walking, talking advertisement for your success. Plus, you probably have someone else to carry it for you when the sun comes out. Living the dream. Mainstream history reminds us that the Viking Age was a period of significant social stratification, with clear distinctions between the different classes. And clothing, including rain gear, was a powerful visual marker of those distinctions. It wasn't just about staying dry, it was about communicating your place in the world. Here's a quirky tidbit that's almost unbelievable but kind of believable. Some sagas mention the use of walrus hides for particularly durable and waterproof garments. Picture yourself strutting around in a walrus skin coat. That's a choice. But hey, it would definitely keep you dry, and probably intimidate your enemies. It'd be like wearing a tank. Now, historians still argue whether the level of social differentiation was as rigid as some sources suggest. Was there as much mobility between classes as we sometimes think? Could a thrall really rise through the ranks and become a jarl? The jury's still out on that one, but it's safe to say that clothing played a significant role in reinforcing existing social hierarchies. But let's get back to you, standing in the rain. Imagine you are that Jarl. You're not just wearing expensive clothes, you're wearing symbols of power. Think of the intricate brooches that fasten your cloak, crafted from silver or even gold. The finely worked leather belt, adorned with precious stones. The fur trim on your boots. It's all carefully designed to project an image of authority and strength. You're not just keeping dry, you're commanding respect. Of course, all this talk of rain gear begs the question, did the Vikings have anything resembling our modern umbrellas? The answer, disappointingly, is probably not. While there's some evidence of parasols being used in other cultures during this period, primarily for sun protection, there's little to suggest that Vikings adopted a similar technology for rain. It simply wasn't practical for seafaring life or for the rugged conditions of Scandinavia. Besides, who needs an umbrella when you have a walrus skin coat? Now, let's lighten the mood a bit. Imagine a Viking fashion show. The thrall shuffles down the runway in his damp wool rags, followed by the freeman in his slightly less damp leather cloak. And then, bam, the Jarl struts out in his full walrus skin regalia, complete with gold brooches and a smug expression. The crowd goes wild. Or maybe they just shrug and go back to tending their fields. It's hard to say. And hey, who's to say the Jarl is having fun? A walrus skin coat must be awful to clean. Here's another light note, I bet no one has a lint roller. A furry bear cloak shedding on everything? You're just living with it. And here's the last of the light jokes, imagine trying to order rain gear online in Viking times. Okay, I need a walrus skin coat, size, extra large Viking. And does it come with free shipping to Scandinavia? Good luck with that. Back to the Vikings and their rain gear and what it all meant. Even the colors of the garments played a role. Natural dyes were used to color fabrics, and certain colors were more expensive and difficult to produce than others. Red, for example, was a symbol of wealth and power, as the dye was derived from rare sources. So, a Jarl wouldn't just wear a fur-lined cloak, he would wear a red fur-lined cloak. Because why not? It's easy to romanticize the Vikings, to imagine them as fearless warriors and intrepid explorers. And while that image certainly has some basis in reality, it's important to remember that they were also real people living in a challenging environment. They had to deal with the same everyday problems that we do, like staying dry in the rain. And the way they tackled those problems provides a fascinating glimpse into their society, their values, and their priorities. Plus, it shows that even in the age of longships and raiding parties, fashion mattered. Maybe even more than we realize. So, next time you're caught in a downpour, take a moment to appreciate your modern rain gear. And remember the Vikings, shivering in their sheepskins, dreaming of walrus skin coats and gold brooches. They might not have had Gore-Tex, but they knew how to make a statement, rain or shine. Okay, settle in, friend. Let's talk about rain. Not just any rain, but the kind of rain that chills you to the bone, the kind that sprays off the bow of a longship as you're desperately trying to navigate by the stars, assuming, of course, that the stars aren't hidden behind a curtain of unrelenting gray. We're diving deep, pun intended, I suppose, into the world of Viking rain gear. Think of it as a cozy historical ASMR experience, seasoned with a dash of snark. Imagine this, you're a Viking sailor, heading west. Maybe to raid a monastery, maybe to trade some walrus ivory, maybe just because you're utterly, irrepressibly, bored back home. The North Atlantic is a fickle beast, even on a good day. Today is not a good day. The wind howls, the waves crash, and the rain, oh, the rain. It's not the gentle, nurturing kind that makes flowers bloom. It's the kind that feels like tiny ice daggers relentlessly attacking your face. You're soaked, cold, and starting to question your life choices. Wouldn't a nice fireside chat and a mug of mead be preferable to this? Alas, duty, or greed, calls. Now, the first thing you might be thinking is, what did these guys even wear? It's a valid question. They didn't have Gore-Tex, that's for sure. Can you imagine a Viking trying to pronounce Gore-Tex? It would probably come out sounding like a particularly aggressive sneeze. What they did have was ingenuity, a reliance on natural materials, and a healthy dose of fatalism. I mean, let's be honest, if you were setting sail in a longship, facing potential sea monsters and rival warriors, a little rain wasn't going to be the thing that kept you up at night. The base layer, naturally, would be wool. Wool is amazing stuff. Even when wet, it retains some of its insulating properties. Think of it as the original performance fabric. You'd probably have a tunic made of wool, maybe some trousers, and definitely some thick woolen socks. Because nothing, absolutely nothing, is worse than cold, wet feet. It's the gateway to misery. A mainstream historical fact. The Vikings were exceptionally skilled at textile production, and wool was a cornerstone of their clothing. A quirky or fringe tidbit. There's some evidence suggesting they might have even used urine to treat the wool, making it even more water-resistant. Don't worry, I'm sure it smelled lovely. Historians still argue whether this was common practice or simply a method employed during times of dire need. You know, like when you've run out of everything else, and nature calls at the same time your wool calls for treatment. But wool alone isn't going to cut it against the North Atlantic. So, what else? Well, animal hides were a popular option. Think sealskin, maybe even walrus hide if you were feeling particularly fancy and had taken down one of those grumpy behemoths. These hides would be treated with oils and fats, often fish oil, to make them more water-resistant. Imagine the smell. A delightful bouquet of wet wool, fish oil, and Viking sweat. It's the scent of adventure. You might have a cloak or a hooded jacket made from this treated hide. It wouldn't be entirely waterproof, but it would certainly offer a significant degree of protection. Let's talk about cloaks for a moment. Cloaks were ubiquitous in Viking society. They weren't just for keeping out the rain, they were a sign of status, a blanket for sleeping, even a makeshift sail in a pinch. Talk about multi-purpose. But for seafaring, a well-oiled, waterproofed cloak would be essential. Think of it as the Viking equivalent of a modern-day raincoat, only infinitely less comfortable and much, much smellier. Now, about headgear. Keeping your head dry is crucial in cold weather. You'd likely wear a woolen cap, maybe even a leather hood attached to your cloak. Some Viking helmets had a nose guard, but they weren't really designed for rain protection. They were more about keeping your nose intact during a battle. And that's a very different kind of storm. Imagine trying to peek over the top of your shield with rain streaming down your face and obscuring your vision. So much for conquering England, right? Speaking of helmets, here's a little joke. Why did the Viking bring an umbrella to the raid? Because he heard it was going to rain. I know, I'll work on my material. But back to the serious business of staying dry. Beyond wool and animal hides, there's also evidence suggesting the use of plant-based materials. Linen, for example, could be treated with oils and waxes to make it more water-resistant. Though linen isn't as warm as wool, it's lighter and more breathable, which could be important during strenuous activity. Imagine hauling on ropes or rowing for hours in the pouring rain. You'd want something that wouldn't weigh you down too much. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some historians speculate that Vikings might have even experimented with layering different materials to maximize water resistance. Imagine a base layer of wool, followed by a layer of oiled linen, and then an outer layer of sealskin. A Viking rain suit, if you will, assembled from the resources they had at hand. A bit like building your own survival kit from scratch. Historians still argue whether they had a sophisticated understanding of layering, or if it was simply a matter of throwing on whatever they could find to stay dry. Now, you might be wondering about footwear. Imagine those wet wool socks sloshing around in a pair of ill-fitting leather shoes. Not a pleasant thought, is it? Vikings typically wore leather shoes or boots. These would have been treated with oils and fats to provide some water resistance. They might also have used wooden soles or added extra layers of leather to protect their feet from the elements. But let's be realistic, after a long day at sea, your feet would still be wet and cold. Such is the life of a Viking sailor. Let's take a moment to appreciate the sheer resourcefulness of these people. They didn't have access to modern technology or synthetic materials. They had to rely on their knowledge of the natural world and their ability to adapt to harsh conditions. They were masters of making do, of squeezing every last drop of usefulness out of the resources available to them. And let's face it, they probably didn't moan about it as much as we would. Alright, one more little historical joke. Why did the Viking refuse to share his umbrella? Because he wanted to keep it for his reign. I promise the jokes will get better with each passing paragraph. Maybe. One particularly intriguing piece of evidence comes from archaeological finds of tools and materials used for treating leather and textiles. These findings suggest that Vikings were not simply slapping some grease on a piece of hide and hoping for the best. They were experimenting with different techniques, refining their methods, and developing specialized tools for the job. Talk about serious craftsmanship. Another important factor to consider is the social aspect of clothing production. In Viking society, textile production was primarily the domain of women. They were the ones who spun the wool, wove the cloth, and treated the hides. This means that their knowledge and skills were essential to the survival of their communities, especially in harsh environments like Scandinavia. So, next time you're cursing the rain, remember the Viking women who tirelessly worked to keep their families dry and safe. They deserve a round of applause. Here's something to ponder: did different Viking settlements have different approaches to rain gear? Did the Vikings in Norway, with their access to dense forests and abundant wildlife, use different materials and techniques than the Vikings in Iceland, who had to rely more on imported goods and limited resources? This is another open debate amongst historians. Regional variations in climate, access to resources, and cultural traditions likely played a significant role in shaping their choices. So, what's the takeaway from all of this? Well, the next time you're caught in a downpour, take a moment to appreciate the fact that you have access to waterproof clothing that is lightweight, breathable, and relatively inexpensive. Think about the Vikings, braving the elements in their heavy, smelly, and only partially effective rain gear. They were tough, resourceful, and incredibly resilient. And they managed to explore vast stretches of the world, conquer new lands, and leave a lasting impact on history, all while battling the elements. It's a testament to the human spirit, really. But let's not romanticize it too much. I bet they were still pretty miserable sometimes. Now, one last quirky tidbit to leave you with: there are accounts in the sagas of Vikings using animal bladders as makeshift waterproof containers. Imagine carrying your lunch in a seal bladder. Appetizing, isn't it? I suspect they only did this out of utter desperation. But again, you've got to admire the ingenuity. And with that, my friend, our journey into the rain-soaked world of Viking seafaring comes to an end. Hopefully, you learned something new, maybe even chuckled a little. Now go forth and face the rain with newfound appreciation for your modern-day gear, and maybe a little bit of Viking spirit. Alright, gather round, you soggy sea dogs. Let's talk about staying dry, Viking style. Now, I know what you're thinking: Vikings. Dry. Weren't they always battling raging seas and torrential downpours? Well, yeah, but even the toughest warrior appreciates a little respite from the elements. Imagine trying to swing a battle axe when your hands are numb from the cold and wet. Not exactly ideal, is it? And no one wants a soggy beard. So, how did these seafaring Scandinavians keep their rain gear in tip-top shape? It wasn't exactly like tossing your Gore-Tex jacket in the washing machine, now, was it? Think more along the lines of elbow grease, natural resources, and a whole lot of patience. I mean, a lot of patience. We're talking about folks who spent months at sea in wooden boats, so you know they weren't afraid of a little hard work. First things first, material matters. While fancy synthetics were a few centuries away, the Vikings had some pretty clever options. Wool, of course, was a staple. Not just for sweaters, but for cloaks and even rudimentary waterproof gear. The magic wasn't just in the wool itself, but in how it was processed. You see, wool contains lanolin, a natural wax that repels water. Think of it as nature's own DWR finish. If you're into modern clothing and spend too much on that stuff, take note, you can apply lanolin, buy it at the store. I do not endorse one brand, I just think that's cool. To maximize its water resistance, the wool would be tightly woven or felted. Felting involves matting the fibers together, creating a dense, almost impenetrable barrier. Imagine the feeling of wet wool on your skin, itchy and uncomfortable, right? Well, the Vikings knew how to minimize that by carefully processing and treating the wool. They also used other materials, like animal hides, treated with various oils and fats. Think of sealskin or even fish skin, meticulously cleaned, tanned, and then coated with rendered animal fat. Not exactly the most fragrant process, I imagine. Picture that smell lingering in your longhouse. Phew. But hey, at least you'd be dry. Although, I wonder how well it held up when those longboats were out in the ocean for a prolonged time. Now, once you had your rain gear, whether it was a wool cloak, an oiled hide poncho, or some combination thereof, the real work began, the maintenance. Keeping these materials in good condition required constant vigilance. One of the most important steps was regular cleaning. Now, I'm not talking about a trip to the dry cleaner. Vikings didn't exactly have access to perchloroethylene. Instead, they relied on natural cleansers like wood ash or even urine. Yes, you heard that right. Urine. Don't knock it till you try it. I'm kidding. I would absolutely never try that. The ammonia in urine can help to break down dirt and grease, while wood ash acts as a mild abrasive. Imagine scrubbing your cloak down with a bucket of, well, let's just say, organic solution, next to a babbling brook. Fun times. But, it was effective, and it was readily available. Gotta do what you gotta do, right? After cleaning, the gear would need to be thoroughly rinsed, usually in a stream or a nearby lake. And then, the all-important re-oiling process. This was crucial for maintaining the water resistance of the hides and even reinforcing the lanolin in the wool. Animal fats were the go-to choice, often rendered from seals, whales, or even livestock. The fat would be warmed and then carefully rubbed into the material, ensuring that every nook and cranny was saturated. This process not only helped to repel water but also kept the hides supple and prevented them from cracking. It's like giving your rain gear a spa treatment. But it wasn't just about applying the oil. It was about doing it right. The Vikings knew that the key was to work the fat deep into the fibers, ensuring that it penetrated every layer. This might involve using a specialized tool, like a smooth stone or even a piece of bone, to massage the oil into the material. And then, of course, there was the drying process. The gear couldn't just be left out in the sun, as that could cause the hides to dry out and crack. Instead, it would be hung in a cool, shady place, allowing it to dry slowly and evenly. Think of a dimly lit longhouse, filled with the aroma of wood smoke and, well, oiled animal hides. Talk about ambience. But maintenance wasn't just about cleaning and oiling. It was also about repairing any damage. A tear in a hide or a hole in a cloak could quickly render the gear useless. So, the Vikings were skilled at mending and patching. They would use bone needles and sinew thread to stitch up rips, and they would use scraps of leather or wool to patch up holes. And here's a fun fact, historians still argue whether the Vikings used sophisticated stitching techniques. Some believe they were masters of needlework, creating intricate and durable repairs. Others argue that their repairs were more rudimentary, focusing on functionality over aesthetics. Either way, the goal was the same, to keep the rain gear in working order. After all, a stitch in time saves 9, right? Now, let's talk about storage. You can't just toss your precious rain gear into a heap on the floor. Proper storage was essential for preserving its condition. Garments were often hung up either on pegs or on ropes strung across the longhouse. This allowed air to circulate, preventing mold and mildew from forming. And for those items that couldn't be hung up, like smaller pieces of leather or felt, they would be stored in chests or boxes, often lined with cedar wood. Cedar has natural insect-repelling properties, which help to keep moths and other pests away. It also gave the gear a pleasant, woodsy scent. Much better than, you know. But it wasn't just about protecting the gear from the elements and pests. It was also about protecting it from damage. The Vikings were careful not to overload their storage containers, as that could cause the gear to become crushed or misshapen. They also avoided storing sharp objects near the gear, as that could lead to tears or punctures. Imagine coming home from a long voyage, only to find that your prized cloak has been shredded by a carelessly placed axe. And, of course, there was the ever-present threat of fire. Longhouses were heated by open fires, and accidents could happen. So, the Vikings were careful to keep their rain gear away from the flames. They might store it in a separate part of the longhouse, or they might even bury it in the ground, wrapped in a waterproof covering. Talk about dedication. One little spark and poof, there goes your hard work down in flames. Maintaining Viking rain gear wasn't easy. It required a lot of time, effort, and knowledge. But it was essential for survival in the harsh Scandinavian climate. And, let's be honest, it was probably a point of pride. Imagine the respect you'd get from your fellow Vikings for having the driest cloak in the village. So, the next time you slip on your rain jacket, take a moment to appreciate the technology and convenience that you have at your disposal. And remember the Vikings, who relied on their ingenuity and resourcefulness to stay dry in a world without Gore-Tex and washing machines. They may not have had all the bells and whistles, but they got the job done. And that's what really matters, right? Oh, and one more thing. Did you know that some historians believe that the Vikings used a type of natural rubber to waterproof their gear? It's based on the discovery of certain tree resins in archaeological sites. It's a fringe theory, but hey, you never know. Maybe they were ahead of their time. I mean, they managed to cross the Atlantic in open boats, so anything's possible, right? You wouldn't catch me trying that without some serious flotation devices. I mean, I love the ocean, but I also love being alive, so, priorities. Alright, settle in, friend. Let's talk about Viking rain gear. I know, not exactly the stuff of high seas adventure, right? We picture the longboats, the axes, maybe a bit of pillaging, but what about staying dry while you're doing all that pillaging? Turns out, keeping the Norsemen and Norsewomen relatively comfortable in the perpetually damp Scandinavian climate was a pretty big deal. So, you're a Viking. You've just hopped off your longship onto the shores of, say, Northumbria. It's drizzling. Of course it's drizzling. The North Sea's a reliable fountain of misty unpleasantness. You're wearing layers, probably wool, maybe some linen underneath. But wool, bless its heart, gets heavy when wet. And nobody wants to raid a monastery with a waterlogged tunic dragging them down. That's where the innovation kicks in. You see, Vikings weren't just berserkers, they were practical berserkers. They were surprisingly adept at using what the land and sea gave them. Think about it, what resources are readily available? Animal hides, of course. Sealskin, for example, was a popular choice. It's naturally oily, which gives it a degree of water resistance. You can almost feel the slick texture under your fingers, can't you? The process of tanning those hides with things like tree bark and urine, yes, urine, created a material that was fairly durable and water repellent. Charming, I know. But effective. Imagine the smell though, probably masked the scent of fear radiating from the villagers, so maybe it was a feature, not a bug. Historians still argue whether the Vikings used specialized techniques to further waterproof these hides, like oiling or waxing, or if the tanning process alone provided sufficient protection. And it wasn't just sealskin. Think fish skin, treated and sewn together to create surprisingly flexible and waterproof garments. You might be picturing something akin to a medieval Michelin man, but it was likely far more streamlined. Picture a long, hooded cloak, perhaps reaching the knees, offering protection from the wind and rain. It's almost like you're cocooned in your own portable, slightly fishy-smelling, weather system. But here's a slightly off-the-wall thought. Some evidence suggests that the Vikings may have experimented with rudimentary forms of waterproofing using plant resins and oils. Birch bark, for instance, contains a natural oil that can be extracted. Now, imagine coating a piece of fabric or leather with this oil and letting it dry. You'd have a surface that's much more resistant to water. It's not exactly Gore-Tex, but it's a far cry from simply hoping the rain stops. Now, you might be thinking, okay, so they had some waterproof cloaks. Big deal. But consider the impact of this technology on later designs. Think about the oilskin coats worn by sailors for centuries. Those owe a direct debt to the practices developed by the Vikings and other seafaring cultures of the North Atlantic. You can almost see the lineage, can't you? The long, weatherproof garments designed to protect against the elements. It's a straight line from a Viking chieftain battling a North Sea squall to a modern-day fisherman hauling in the day's catch. Consider also the Inuit. They had extremely advanced rain gear as well, made of seal and other animal products. Coincidence? Maybe, but these cultures were definitely in contact through trade and sometimes, less friendly activities. And it wasn't just clothing. The Vikings were masters of shipbuilding, and waterproofing was crucial for the integrity of their longboats. They used a combination of techniques, including caulking the seams with tar and applying coatings of animal fat or resin to the hull. This kept the ships afloat and prevented water damage to the cargo. And think of this, the longship design spread across the world, and the waterproofing techniques went with them. Even seemingly unrelated things like the development of waxed canvas can be traced back, in a roundabout way, to the Vikings' need to stay dry. It's all about necessity being the mother of invention. If you're living in a region where it rains more often than not, you're going to figure out how to deal with it. Think about the evolution of the sou'wester hat, the classic floppy rain hat worn by sailors. Its origins can arguably be linked to similar head coverings used by Norse seafarers. They needed something to keep the rain out of their eyes, and they weren't exactly going to settle for a flimsy straw hat. The sou'wester, with its wide brim and ability to deflect water away from the face, is a testament to the enduring legacy of Viking-era weather protection. Now, a quirky tidbit, some sagas mention the use of animal bladders as waterproof containers. Picture a Viking packing his lunch in a cured pig bladder. Stylish? Debatable. Practical? Absolutely. Historians still argue whether these bladders were primarily used for food storage or if they were also employed for protecting other valuable items from the rain. We can also consider the way Vikings built their houses. Think about the sod roofs, designed to insulate and protect against the elements. While not exactly rain gear, they demonstrate a clear understanding of how to manage water and prevent it from seeping into their homes. The design was remarkably effective, although I imagine re-roofing could be a real pain. Hey Sven, could you get the sod? So, what's the big takeaway here? It's that the Vikings weren't just about raiding and pillaging. They were also resourceful innovators who developed practical solutions to the challenges of their environment. Their techniques for waterproofing clothing, ships, and even dwellings had a lasting impact on later designs and technologies. From the oilskin coats worn by sailors to the waxed canvas tents used by campers, the legacy of Viking rain gear is still with us today. Now, don't start thinking that Vikings invented everything useful for inclement weather. Umbrellas date back thousands of years earlier and were definitely not invented by Vikings. Some Vikings may have seen an umbrella and thought, hey, that's neat, but the real credit goes to early civilizations like China. It's kind of funny to think about, isn't it? These fierce warriors, braving the open sea, also had a very real concern about staying dry. It's a reminder that even the most formidable figures in history were still human, subject to the same everyday annoyances as the rest of us. Next time you're caught in a downpour, take a moment to appreciate the ingenuity of the Vikings and their enduring legacy of rain gear. And maybe, just maybe, consider packing your lunch in a pig bladder. Okay, maybe not. But you get the idea. Before you go, let's do a quick sensory exercise. Close your eyes. Imagine the smell of salt spray, the feel of rough wool against your skin, and the sound of rain pelting against the deck of a longship. Now, add to that the faint but unmistakable aroma of, well, let's just call it, tanned hide. You're practically a Viking now. Just try not to pillage anything on your way out. Alright, settle in, friends. Let's talk Viking rain gear. Yes, rain gear. Because even those fearsome Norsemen, those seafaring raiders, weren't immune to a good, old-fashioned soaking. But forget about Gore-Tex and breathable membranes. We're going way back, to a time when waterproof probably meant slightly less wet. Now, picture this, you're a Viking, right? You've just rowed your longship across the choppy North Sea. Your beard is dripping, your tunic is clinging uncomfortably, and the wind is howling. Not exactly the heroic saga you signed up for, is it? Time to reach for your, what exactly? That's the question, isn't it? Because, honestly, what did Vikings use to keep dry? We don't have a lot of perfectly preserved Viking raincoats lying around in museums, do we? Instead, you need to rely on archaeological fragments, sagas, and a healthy dose of educated guesswork. Historians still argue whether certain textiles found in Viking burials were specifically for rain protection, or if they were just everyday clothing. One common theory involves wool, and it's your first line of defense. See, wool, especially when it's densely woven and treated with lanolin, that natural grease sheep produce, it's surprisingly water-resistant. Imagine a thick, woolen cloak, maybe a sort of vadmal, a coarse, felted wool cloth. It's heavy, sure, and probably smells faintly of sheep, bonus, but it'll keep a lot of rain off you. Think of it as the Viking equivalent of a slightly damp, slightly scratchy security blanket. Another option would be leather. Animal hides, treated and tanned, can be pretty effective at shedding water. You could picture a leather jerkin or even leggings. Imagine the tanning process, soaking the hides in urine and tree bark. Fun stuff, right? I trust you appreciate your modern rain jacket a bit more now. But, let's be real, even the best wool or leather will eventually get saturated. And when it does, you're basically wearing a cold, heavy sponge. Not ideal for raiding monasteries or, well, anything really. So, what other tricks did they have up their sleeve? Or rather, under their cloak? This is where things get a little more interesting. Some researchers suggest the use of oiled linen or canvas. Linen, when treated with oils like linseed oil, derived from flax seeds, can become reasonably water-resistant. It's a bit like waxing a jacket today. It makes sense, since flax was a common crop. Historians still argue whether the Vikings used linseed oil on clothing, since the process isn't explicitly described in the sagas. Maybe they were trying to keep the secret to themselves. Now, here's where we get into the fun part, the modern reconstructions. People, bless their historically minded hearts, have been experimenting with recreating Viking-era rain gear. You trudge through the forest, wearing a newly made woolen cloak. It's raining, of course. Otherwise, what's the point? You can immediately tell that the wool absorbs the water, but it takes a while to soak through. It's not perfect, but it's definitely better than nothing. You can almost feel like a Viking, until your phone buzzes in your pocket. Then you try out the oiled linen. It feels a bit stiff and smells a bit like, well, linseed oil. It repels the water much better than the wool, at least initially. Water beads up and rolls off. You're practically dry. For about half an hour. Then, the oil starts to wear off, and you begin to feel the dampness creeping in. Maybe they needed to re-oil their clothing more frequently. And here's a quirky tidbit, some believe that Vikings might have used fish skin to make waterproof clothing. Fish skin, when properly processed, can be surprisingly durable and water-resistant. Imagine a jacket made of salmon or cod skin. A bit fishy smelling, perhaps, but effective. No, I didn't say fishy. It's more of a fringe theory, of course, since actual archaeological evidence is scarce. You can also imagine the layers. Multiple layers of wool, linen, and maybe even animal skins, would provide better protection than any single garment. Think of it as the Viking version of layering for cold weather, but for rain. It's all about trapping air and creating a barrier against the elements. Of course, the effectiveness of any rain gear depends on the severity of the weather. A light drizzle is one thing. A torrential downpour in the North Sea is another. And let's not forget about the wind. Wind-driven rain can find its way into every nook and cranny, regardless of what you're wearing. Maybe that's why the Vikings sometimes preferred to stay indoors, drinking mead and telling stories. The sagas, while often filled with epic battles and heroic deeds, rarely delve into the mundane details of everyday life. They don't exactly give you a materials list for Viking rain gear. But you can read between the lines. You have to imagine the challenges they faced, the resources they had available, and the ingenuity they used to survive. So, the next time you're caught in the rain, and you're reaching for your high-tech, waterproof jacket, take a moment to think about the Vikings. Think about their woolen cloaks, their oiled linen, and their maybe fish skin raincoats. And be grateful for modern technology. Because let's face it, being a Viking in the rain probably wasn't all that glamorous. Although, historians still argue whether the Vikings considered constant discomfort simply the price of doing business. And honestly, it probably smelled terrible. Now, close your eyes for a moment. Imagine the soft sound of rain, the gentle rocking of a longship on calm water, not a raging storm. Just a quiet, steady rainfall. You're wearing a simple woolen cloak, heavy and comforting. The air is cool and damp, but you're not cold. You feel a sense of peace, a connection to the past. The scent of wool and a hint of wood smoke fill the air. The rain softens, becomes a mist. The details of the landscape begin to fade, blurring into a gentle watercolor. The sounds of the modern world recede, replaced by the whisper of the wind and the rhythmic lapping of water against the hull. There's no need to rush, no need to worry. Just breathe deeply, and let the calm wash over you. Allow yourself to drift into a state of quiet relaxation, a peaceful sanctuary away from the stresses of the day. The image of the rain-soaked Viking fades, becoming lighter and softer. You're safe, warm, and comfortable. Let the gentle sounds and calming sensations guide you into a state of restful slumber. You are surrounded by peace and tranquility. And now, you drift, further, away, into sleep. Sweet dreams.